My name is Brian, and without my automobile security camera, I would never have known the truth. I would have continued to believe a lie, thinking my marriage was strong. I thought my wife was loyal. Once I saw it, there was no turning back. Now, before we get into the details, I'd like you to think about this. How well do you actually know your partner? Could they be leading a double life right under your nose? I used to believe that Caroline, my wife, would never betray me. And yet, here I am, giving you this story. So, stick with me until the end. Because I want to know what you would have done if you were in my situation. Would you have handled things the same way? Would you have done something differently? Let's get to it. I have been married to Caroline for 7 years. I never had a cause to disbelieve her. I've always believed that if you love someone, you don't sit around and play detective. You accept their word for it. That is how I saw things. For 7 years, that belief remained unchanged. I have a business that requires me to travel frequently. It is part of the job. Some months, I travel once or twice. Other times, I might be gone for weeks. It's not perfect, but the pay is good. And I made certain Caroline was comfortable. I always made time for her while I was present. I returned from my latest trip. I'm relieved to finally be home with my wife after a week of back-to-back meetings, lengthy flights, and little sleep. I really wanted a calm day to settle in. The next morning, I decided to take my BMW 7 Series for a little drive to pick up a few items for myself. But as soon as I started the automobile, I realized something was amiss. The engine did not sound as smooth as it should. It had a rough texture. Then a maintenance alert appeared on the dashboard. That did not make sense. I had just maintained the automobile before I went, and it was operating perfectly. Then there was no explanation why it was acting up now. Unless something had occurred while I was away. I stepped back inside and saw Caroline in the kitchen. I asked her straight up, "Did you drive the automobile while I was away?" She scarcely paused before responding. "Yes, I borrowed it to see a friend." That was it. There are no extra details. And there was no reason for me to press any farther. It was only a car, right? If she needed something, she needed it. I accepted her answer without hesitation. I stormed into the car shop, frustrated beyond words. When I saw the mechanic, I didn't hold back. "What kind of servicing did you perform on my car?" I demanded. "I brought it in only last week before my trip. And it's already giving me problems. Do you really know what you're doing?" The mechanic, a middle-aged man with grease-stained hands, wiped his forehead with the back of his arm and glanced at me, slightly perplexed. He did not argue. Did not become defensive. I let out a short sigh before silently strolling over to my car. He opened the hood and began inspecting things. I stood there with arms folded, still seething. "I honestly don't know what you guys did, but this is absurd. I pay a lot of money to keep this automobile in good condition, and it's suddenly acting as if it hasn't been serviced for months." The mechanic simply hummed to himself, his fingers gliding over the engine as he performed diagnostics. A few minutes passed in silence, save for the odd click of his tools. I expected him to accept his mistake, or at least provide an explanation, but he said nothing. As the mechanic tried to diagnose the problem, he put in his scan tool and performed a system check. Then he switched to the car's infotainment system, manipulating the settings with a custom skill. I was still standing there, arms crossed, waiting for him to admit that they had botched the previous service. But instead of discussing the car's performance, he abruptly turned to me and said something that absolutely confused me. "You might wish to check your security cameras. It recorded anything intriguing following the service." I blinked, caught off guard. "What?" He didn't look up right away. His fingers were still lightly tapping on the infotainment screen. When he finally looked into my eyes, his expression was unreadable. "Does your automobile have a dash cam?" His tone of voice was questioning. Careful, almost overly casual. What if I were you? I glanced at the footage. You might find it useful. My annoyance at the car's unexpected breakdown evaporated. What the hell was he talking about? What could possibly be noteworthy about the footage? I could tell by the way he said it. This was not a routine engine issue. Something else was happening. I breathed sharply and pulled out my phone, activating the dashcam app with my fingertips hovering over the most recent videos. I hesitated for a little moment. I had no idea what I was going to see. Caroline was seen unlocking my car, getting into it, and driving away as if nothing had happened. Just her securely behind the wheel, driving exactly where she said she was going to her friend's place. The footage did not end at her friend's residence. Following this, another clip played. It was not only Caroline. She was still in the driver's seat, but there were other passengers in the car, her pals. They were laughing and conversing. "I'm excited about something." I frowned. This is not what she told me. She had simply mentioned going to her friend's apartment, not going out together so late. That night, I watched them pull out of the driveway and into the main road. I immediately knew the route. I knew exactly where they were going. A nightclub. I paused the video for a bit and tried to make sense of it. Caroline never mentioned having a girls' night out. If it was simply for fun, why didn't she inform me? I was perplexed, but I wasn't prepared for the next clip. That will change everything. A third clip appeared on the screen. The timestamp indicated hours later. Caroline was still in my car, but her buddies were nowhere to be seen. Instead, she had company. A man I did not recognize. They were parked in a dark and empty lot. The streetlights barely lighted the car's interior, but I could see well enough. I could see everything. Caroline and this man were leaning in close, whispering something I couldn't hear. And without hesitation, she kissed him. My stomach sank. I watched as they dissolved into one another. Hands roaming, bodies pressing together as if they'd been waiting for this moment. This was profound and intense. They came to a halt shortly, laughing gently and passing the keys, before he took the wheel and they drove away together. I didn't even have to guess where they were headed. The next bend they took was straight toward the motel. I sat perfectly still. My brain could not grasp what it was witnessing quickly enough. I had called Caroline the night before, while still on my trip. I asked what she was up to. I just checked in as I always did, and she said she was home. She lied without hesitation. I should have been paying attention to the mechanic who was still working on my car, explaining something about the harsh idol, but I barely heard anything. My thoughts were focused on the truth of what I had just witnessed. I would not have known if the security camera hadn't caught it. I would have returned home, kissed her, slept next to her, and continued on as if nothing had occurred. But now I knew, and there was no going back. That evening, I sat across from Caroline in the living room. The home was quiet, save for the low hum of the refrigerator. She was scrolling through her phone. I took a deep breath and kept my voice quiet. "How was your weekend?" I asked, keeping a tight eye on her. She barely looked up and replied casually, "That was fine." I nodded, appearing to accept her response before asking, "Did you go somewhere fun?" That's when she paused. Just a second. She shook her head. "No. I was at home all day, just relaxing." She was lying again, but this time in my face, with no hint of uncertainty or guilt. I paused for a while before placing my phone on the table, unlocked the screen and then pressed play. My automobile was seen moving out of the driveway, with Caroline in the driver's seat. Her head snapped to the screen, eyes widen. She sat up upright. "What is this?" she inquired, her voice becoming weaker. I didn't respond. I just let the video play. It showed her meeting up with her companions, all dressed up and joking, before heading out to the club. I looked at her. She was blinking rapidly, her mind searching for an excuse. "It's not what it seems," she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't say anything. I just skipped forward. The following video showed her in the parking lot, tangled up with a guy kissing. That was when she lost it. She shot up from her seat. "Brian, let me explain." Her hands were shaking now. Her voice sounded desperate. I had been drinking. I wasn't thinking clearly. I still did not speak. I simply fast-forwarded to the point where they drove off to a hotel. That's when she finally snapped. She sank back into her chair, hands over her face. She murmured, barely audible, "I messed up. I did not intend for that to happen. I was inebriated and couldn't think well." I glanced at her, feeling only disgust. Alcohol. That was her excuse. I trusted the woman I married. I expected to believe she cheated by accident. I leaned back. As a result, my wife becomes a loose lady. The moment she becomes drunk. She winced at my comments but did not object. That's when it struck me. It was probably not the first time. She was far too comfortable lying to me. If my car's camera hadn't caught her, would she have told me or continued on as if she wasn't betraying me? I gazed at her. I had been with this woman for 7 years, and realized I had forgotten who she was. If this was just one night, how many more had there been? How many times had she lied to me while I was out there working hard? The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I wasn't only losing my wife. I was losing my entire sense of trust. I spent the next week lost in my own thoughts, repeating everything in my mind. I wanted to believe there was a solution, but there was none. The woman I trusted could simply lie to my face. She may do it more than once. I could not live like that. Constant questioning. Constantly wondering what else she was concealing. Trust is not restored simply because someone sobs and apologizes. By the 8th day, I realized there was no way ahead. That evening, I invited Caroline into the living room. She sat gingerly, as if she realized something was about to happen. Her fingers gripped the hem of her shirt, as if she were bracing for contact. I did not squander time. I told her we were finished. No lengthy explanations. I offered her two options. First, we could get divorced quietly. No drama, no mess. She would leave, and we would go our separate ways. If she chose to battle me on this, I had proof that the tape was not a hoax. When she thought no one was looking, I'd make certain that everyone saw who she really was. I saw the panic in her eyes as she realized there was no way out of this. If the footage leaked, her reputation and carefully cultivated image would be ruined. She opened her mouth, likely to beg for another explanation, but then closed it again. She realized there was nothing she could say to undo what had already happened. After a lengthy and uncomfortable silence, she nodded. She agreed. The next morning, she packed her belongings. There was no long emotional goodbye. No last-ditch attempt to change my opinion. Just a lady cramming her life into a couple of bags, knowing she could only blame herself. I did not watch her leave. I did not need to. She was already on her way to me when she walked out that door. When the dust settled and Caroline left my life, I found myself sitting alone in our now empty house. I immediately realized that moving on was not as simple as signing divorce papers. The wound did not close overnight. If the lady I'd committed my heart to could betray me so easily, how could I ever trust anybody else? The prospect of starting over with someone new was exhausting, and, to be honest, I was terrified. So, instead of dealing with my emotions, I buried myself in work. My business became my refuge, my safe haven. Numbers do not lie. Profits do not cheat. And success does not whisper empty promises into your ear at night. If I couldn't have stability and love, I'd want it in my career. For a while, that worked. The lengthy hours shielded me from thinking about what I had lost. That much. But, deep down, I realized this wasn't a lasting answer. I knew I couldn't hide behind my employment indefinitely. One day I'll try again. One day, I'll probably meet someone who will demonstrate that love isn't necessarily a game of deception. But not today, not now. I was still gathering up the shards of the life I assumed I had. So now I'd like to hear from you. What would you do if you were in my position? Would you have handled things differently? Would you have attempted to work it out, or would you have walked away, as I did? The huge question. Can you ever forgive such a betrayal? Because I understand myself. Even if I'd tried, I doubt I'll ever be able to look at her the same way again. Please let me know in the comments. I'd want to hear what you think. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, someone who may be disregarding red flags in their own relationship, forward it to them. Allow them to witness how quickly trust may be lost. Here's the next story. My wife, Vanessa, stood across from me. Her stance was stiff. Arms crossed, flaming with frustration. On the verge of an eruption. Her voice broke the silence. Sharp, commanding. Look, I won't repeat myself. Anderson needs assistance, and you are being completely selfish. I took a deep breath and carefully set down my coffee cup. Vanessa, we've gone over this. It's not about selfishness. It's about prioritizing. Anderson has become overly reliant on us, and it is time for him to take responsibility for his own actions. Vanessa's jaw tightened, and her lips pressed into a fine line. He's my brother, she yelled, her tone increasing. Family helps family. That's what we promised when we married. Family members also learn to stand on their own 2 feet. I responded, my voice calm yet forceful. I didn't want to aggravate the situation, but I also couldn't back down. We've gotten Anderson out of more situations than I can count. He needs to learn to deal with his issues without bringing us down with him. Vanessa moved closer, yanking out the chair across from me with a piercing squeak before sitting quickly. Her expression was set like stone. Her penetrating eyes locked on me. You don't understand, do you? She remarked, her voice low and shaking with barely contained rage. You have never had siblings, so you don't understand. Understand? You don't understand what it means to be there for someone no matter what. Her words sting, but I forced myself to remain calm. You're correct, Vanessa. I do not have siblings. I spoke evenly, but that doesn't mean I don't comprehend responsibility. And right now, my first responsibility is to us, our finances, and our future. I can't keep contributing when Anderson clearly has no intention of changing. The hush that followed was smothering. I could see the rage welling up behind her eyes, her fists gripping the table's edge as if to keep herself in check. Then, without warning, she snatched her coffee cup and threw the contents at me. Time appeared to slow as the dark liquid arced through the air. Before I could react, it hit me square in the face. The boiling heat scorched my skin, and I gasped, the shock more intense than the agony. The mug clattered onto the table, its harsh sound reverberating throughout the otherwise quiet kitchen. For a minute, I simply sat there, startled. My face burned. My shirt was saturated, and my hands trembled slightly as I sought for a handkerchief to wipe away the sting of the liquid. Vanessa stood frozen. Her expression was a mix of rage and something resembling remorse. But it was fleeting. Her lips parted as if she intended to say something, but she did not. I finally broke the silence. What the hell? Vanessa. My voice was low and quiet, but my incredulity held more weight than if I had shouted. You pushed me. Look, she added defensively, with a note of uneasiness in her tone. I did not mean no. I cut her off while standing slowly. You intended it. You were angry, and you meant everything you said. I pointed to my drenched clothing and red flesh. This isn't only about Anderson. This is about control. About you believing you can influence me into doing whatever you want, regardless of how it affects me or us. Vanessa's face stiffened again. The moment of hesitation is gone. You're being dramatic, she remarked, waving her dismissive hand. It's only coffee. You're acting like I've interrupted. Because that is just what you did, Vanessa. And don't dare to diminish it for the first time. I saw a difference in her expression. Not guilt or regret, but something closer to resistance. If you had simply agreed to assist Anderson, none of this would have occurred, she added, her voice rising again. Luke, this is on you. I stared at her, my thoughts whirling. Had she always behaved this way? Had I overlooked the warning indications of stress, passion, or love? Or had everything altered so slowly that I hadn't noticed until now? I believe we're done here. I eventually spoke, my voice flat. I need some room, without awaiting a response. I turned and left the kitchen. The morning sunlight, once warm and welcoming, now seemed like a harsh mockery of what should have been. As I walked to the restroom to wash the coffee off my face, one idea echoed in my head. This isn't only about breakfast. This is about everything. I stood at the sink and let the cold water flow over my face. The sting from the coffee stayed on my skin. The crimson in my reflection was not only physical. It reminded me of something deeper. Something had cracked in my marriage, perhaps beyond repair. I turned off the faucet and leaned heavily against the sink, watching the water drop from my chin. The man peering back at me in the mirror appeared exhausted, with heavy circles under my eyes that hadn't been there in years. How did I get here? When did Vanessa become someone who could hurl coffee at me during an argument? Or perhaps the actual question was, when did I stop recognizing the lady I married? As the chilly air from the vent reached my moist skin, memories began to rush in my thoughts. I remembered our early days, Vanessa and I, joking over burnt dinners in our first small apartment. We stayed up late and spoke about our dreams. Her criticizing me for my fixation with organizing the spice rack. Those moments felt like they were from another lifetime. We were a team back then. Whatever happened, we were always there for each other. But somewhere along the way, something changed. Vanessa had changed. Perhaps I had changed. And I was only now noticing it. Then there was Anderson, her brother. He had always been a cause of contention between us from the beginning. Vanessa insisted that aiding him was an essential part of having a family. At first, I agreed, lending him money and paying his rent once or twice. But the demands did not stop, and they were never little. A new car because his previous one did not fit his image. A trip to the Bahamas to relax following a failed business venture that never materialized. Vanessa often defended him and made excuses for him. He's just going through a difficult period, she'd explain. He will repay us once he is on his feet. Yet he never did. I tried to establish boundaries, but Vanessa always pushed back. It's my brother Luke, she would say. Her tone was exasperated. How could you be so heartless? The word uncaring always cuts hard. I spent years debating myself, wondering if I was being too strict and inflexible. But, deep inside, I knew the truth. This was not about being heartless. This was about feeling tired emotionally, financially, and physically. I ran my hand through my hair, feeling the stiffness in my shoulders. Vanessa has crossed the line before today. It was simply the most blatant. Raised voices, guilt trips, and covert jabs at my character. They'd been happening for years, but I'd convinced myself that it wasn't as horrible as it seemed. It's only a hard patch. All couples argue that she is stressed. Things will improve. But will they? Or was I lying to myself all along? The gentle drip of the faucet brought me back to the present. I straightened and looked at my mirror again. My shirt was damaged. The coffee stains spread like a bruise on the fabric. Sighing, the first took it off, placed it in the laundry basket, and got a new one from the cabinet. The mere process of changing felt almost meaningful, like peeling away a layer of myself. I no longer required it. As I buttoned up the clean shirt, a new thought began to emerge. What if it wasn't just about Anderson, the coffee, or the debate itself? What if it was about a pattern? A pattern in which I bent, compromised, and gave while Vanessa took and wanted more. What if I didn't want to continue living like this? The thought was uncomfortable, but it conveyed a peculiar clarity. For years, I told myself that staying on was the only option and that walking away would imply failure, betrayal, and weakness. But now, standing in that toilet, I began to question if holding on was the true betrayal, a betrayal of myself. I turned away from the mirror and headed back into the bedroom. Vanessa was nowhere to be seen. The silence in the home felt heavy and oppressive. My phone vibrated on the nightstand. I instinctively picked it up. A text from Thomas, my dearest friend. We hadn't chatted much in the previous year. Vanessa never liked him. He claimed he was a harmful influence. But now, seeing his name on the screen, I felt compelled to answer. Me? Hey, are you busy? His reply came almost immediately. Thomas. For you? Never. What's up? I stared at the screen, my thumb hanging above the keyboard. How do you express in a few words that your marriage is disintegrating? That the person you thought you'd spend your life with just hurled coffee at your face? That you're beginning to question whether staying is the worst decision you've ever made? Finally, I decided on a simple response. Me? Can we speak? Thomas. Of course. Come over when you're ready. As I put down the phone, a peculiar mix of emotions surged inside me. Relief, apprehension, and an uneasy sense of hope. I had no idea what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, I was beginning to consider what I needed, what I desired, and perhaps, just maybe, that was the first step towards something better. I sat in my car, parked outside the large apartment complex, grasping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing keeping me grounded. The journey over had been a blur, with my thoughts reliving everything from breakfast. My cheeks still tingled where the coffee had burned, but the true agony was deeper, stuck in my chest. The prospect of returning to Vanessa's place felt oppressive, but sitting here trying to make sense of everything was not much better. Thomas resided in a modern apartment building with clean lines and bright colors, which Vanessa would have described as soulless. Ironic, given how hollow I felt coming through our front door every day. I grabbed my phone and texted him. Me? I'm here. A moment later, the building's door opened, and there he stood, dressed in trousers and a faded hoodie. His hair still messy from sleep. Thomas and I had been friends since college, despite bad breakups. Late-night study sessions and too many beers at the neighborhood dive bar. He grinned when he saw me, but as he approached, his smile faded. Luke. He spoke carefully, as if he were talking to someone on the edge of a precipice. What's happening? You appear to have been hit by a truck, not a truck. I answered, suppressing a faint laugh. Coffee? His brow furrowed, but he did not press. Come on up. No mass apartment looked precisely like I remembered it. Cluttered, but cozy, mismatched furnishings. There is a faint smell of coffee and cinnamon in the air. He motioned me toward the couch before disappearing into the kitchen. Moments later, he reappeared with 2 mugs and handed one to me. I figured coffee wasn't your thing right now, he continued, indicating the tea. I offered him a modest, thankful grin and took a sip. The warmth was pleasant, but it did not relieve the knot in my gut. Thomas sat across from me and waited. He always knew when to be silent, which is probably why Wood and I were friends for so long. It's Vanessa. I finally spoke, my voice sounding strange in the quiet room. This morning, she threw coffee in my face. Thomas's eyes widened, but he did not interrupt. I drank another sip of tea, then let the words flood out of the fight. Anderson's enlisted man Vanessa's refusal to establish boundaries. Finally, when she snapped the scalding liquid, the searing flesh, and the rebellious words that followed, she admitted it was my fault. I whispered, my voice unsteady, that if I had simply done what she desired, it would not have happened. Thomas slumped back in his chair, his face grim. That's not okay. I don't care what the disagreement was about. That's not okay. I nodded and swallowed hard. I know, I said quietly, but I do not know what to do. Thomas gazed at me for a long time, his expression opaque. Finally, he leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. Look, I won't tell you what to do, he added calmly. But you have been miserable for a long time, Luke. Every time we talk, it's another battle or dispute. Another method Vanessa uses makes you feel bad. And each time you tell me the same thing, it becomes better. But, hasn't it? I shook my head and looked down at the tea in my hands. No, it is not. Thomas inhaled his tone. Careful. Maybe it's time to stop waiting for things to get better. Perhaps it's time to think about what's best for you. The words hit me like a blow in the stomach. I'd spent a lot of time attempting to fix things. Attempting to make Vanessa happy. Trying to keep things together. I hadn't paused to consider what I wanted or needed in years. I don't know where to start. I admitted, my voice barely audible. Thomas nodded, his countenance softened. That is okay. You don't need to figure everything out right now. Simply take it one step at a time. First step. Do not go back to the residence tonight. I looked up at him, shocked. What? Stay here. He replied simply. At least for tonight. Allow yourself some time to ponder without her breathing down your neck. The prospect of staying away for even one night seemed terrible. However, it was a relief. I had no idea what I needed. Are you certain? I do not wish to impose. Thomas rolled his eyes. You are not imposing. Besides, I have beer in the fridge, and a couch that is much more comfortable than it appears. What else do you need? For the first time all day, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe he was correct. Maybe I didn't need all of the answers right away. Perhaps the first step was simply stepping back. I laid my mug on the coffee table. Okay, I said finally. I will stay. Thomas grinned and clapped me on the shoulder. Good. Let's order some pizza now. Watch anything silly on TV and forget about your crazy wife for a few hours. I laughed. Shaky, yet real. For the first time in what seemed like forever. I didn't feel as alone. The route ahead was still uncertain, but at least I wasn't trekking alone. And that was enough for now. The morning light filtered through Thomas's living room blinds, casting broad shadows on the mismatched furniture. I'd scarcely slept, the couch being far less comfortable than Thomas had promised. The rough cushions and new surroundings did not keep me awake, however. It dawned on me that my life as I knew it was disintegrating. I glanced at the ceiling, listening for the faint noises of traffic outside the other room. Thomas's snores echoed, strangely comfortable. Just knowing that someone else was present. I had not told him everything yet. I had avoided the deeper difficulties, keeping the ugly aspects of my marriage hidden even from myself. But after last night's chat, I realized I couldn't avoid the reality much longer. I was already nursing my second cup of coffee when Thomas walked into the living room, rubbing the sleep out of his eyes. He arched an eyebrow, his unkempt hair and faded t-shirt in stark contrast to my anxious, restless demeanor. You're awake early, he said, moving to the kitchen. Where exactly did you sleep? Not much, I said, peering into my mug. Too much on my thoughts. Thomas reappeared with his own coffee and settled into the armchair across from me. He said nothing. Just watch me with that patient knowing look he used to give me when he knew I was going to crack. And crack I did. I don't know what to do, I muttered, my voice breaking slightly. I don't know where to start. Thomas leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. Start by telling me everything. No holding back. I paused. The words stopped in my throat. But then, like a deluge breaking through a dam, they rushed out faster than I could control. I told him about the years of arguments, the continual guilt trips, and how Vanessa would twist every scenario to make me feel like the evil guy. I informed him about Anderson's constant demands, and how I tried to set boundaries only to have them ignored. Finally, I told him what happened yesterday morning. The coffee and the charges. Vanessa's expression as she realized what she had done. Thomas did not interrupt. He did not provide easy fixes or empty reassurances. He was just listening. His look became darker with each syllable. By the end, I felt wrung out, like if I'd poured every ounce of rage and frustration into the space between us. Thomas steadily expelled his voice. Look, this is more than just a difficult patch. This is abuse. The word struck me like a slap. Abuse. I'd resisted calling it such. I was certain that what I was going through was not awful enough to justify the term. But hearing Thomas speak it aloud, without hesitation or doubt, made me realize I had been lying to myself for years. I'm not sure what to do, I said gently again, this time. Thomas sat back and crossed his arms. You don't need all of the solutions right now, Luke, but the first step is admitting you need help. Real assistance. A lawyer, perhaps even a therapist. Someone who can help you find out how to get out of this situation. I nodded carefully, letting his words sink in. However, hiring a lawyer sounded pricey. Thomas smirked. Fortunately for you, I know a guy well. More like a guy's pal, but he's fine. This type of situation arises frequently. I will give him a call. Are you certain? I asked. I do not want to waste his time. Thomas's expression stiffened. Look, it's not a waste of time. You've been coping with this for several years. It is time to put yourself first. The concept was both alarming and strangely liberating. I had spent so much time bending over myself to keep Vanessa happy, avoid disagreement, and keep the peace. The concept of putting myself first seemed selfish, but maybe Thomas was correct. Perhaps it was not selfish. Perhaps it was required. Okay, I said finally. Call him. Thomas grinned and pulled out his phone. This is not something you will regret. As he stepped onto the balcony to make the call, I fell back into the couch and took a nervous breath for the first time in years. I sensed a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was sufficient. Thomas returned. grinning. Good news. You can see me tomorrow morning. I'll accompany you if you wish. I nodded in gratitude. Thank you, Thomas. I don't believe I can accomplish this alone. You are not alone, he spoke aggressively. Not anymore. The remainder of the day was a haze of preparation and execution. We created a list of everything I needed to accomplish, including gathering vital documents, secure my finances, begin looking for somewhere to stay. It was overwhelming. However, seeing it written down helped it feel more manageable. I felt like I'd finally found a route out of the turmoil I'd been in for so long. As the evening progressed, I felt lighter, as if an invisible weight had been lifted. I was not out of the woods, not even close, but for the first time, I could see the way forward. And that was enough for now. The next morning, sunshine flooded through the blinds of Thomas's flat, too bright and nearly invasive. I hadn't gotten much sleep again, but this time it wasn't because I was restless. It was anticipation, anxiety, dread. Today I finally have everything. It was time to be clear that I could no longer do this. Thomas was already up and pacing the small kitchen, his phone in hand. All right, he murmured, looking at me. The lawyer is expecting you this afternoon. But first, you need to have that conversation with Vanessa. I nodded, my stomach twisting in knots. I spent all night practicing what I want to say. But now that the time has come, my mind is blank. How can you tell your wife that the life you've created together is over? How do you deal with something that, for better or worse, has been your entire life for years? Are you sure you don't want me to come with you? Thomas inquired, leaning on the countertop. I shake my head. No, I must do this alone. If she sees you, it will only offer her something else to concentrate on. This should be between me and her. Thomas did not seem convinced, but he nodded. All right. Just call me if things get out of control. I promised, but deep down I had no idea what out of hand meant anymore. Hadn't we already crossed the line? Isn't the coffee incident enough? The journey back to the house felt strangely familiar. Every turn and landmark became carved in my memory like a map from which I could not escape. My hands trembled as I pulled into the driveway. I sat for a time, staring at the front door. It appeared so commonplace, deceptively normal. But I knew better. Behind that door was the life I was going to leave behind. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. My legs felt heavy as lead as I walked up to the house, each step being a small decision to let go. Inside, everything was still. The only sound was the gentle hum of the fridge in the kitchen. Vanessa sat at the dining table, scrolling through her phone. A mug of coffee appeared in front of her for a brief moment. The situation appeared serene, but the tension in the air was oppressive. She looked up as I walked in. Her look is unreadable. You've returned, she remarked simply, her voice devoid of affection. I nodded and laid my keys on the counter. We need to talk. Vanessa's brow furrowed over what? Is it about Anderson? The first will not do this again. It's not only about Anderson, I explained. Despite the fury roaring inside, my voice remained firm. It's about us and everything. She rolled her eyes and leaned back in her chair. Okay, here we go. Another lecture on how I am the problem. Go ahead, Luke. Get that out of your system. I clutched the edge of the counter to ground myself. Vanessa, this is not working. I tried, but it didn't work. The arguments and demands. How you treat me. This is not what a marriage should be. Her eyes narrowed, and her lips formed a thin line. Oh. So now I'm the villain? Is this it? You're the ideal husband. And I am the wicked wife that does not appreciate you. This is not about blaming, I added, trying to keep my voice quiet. It's important to recognize that this connection has become poisonous for both of us. And I can't do it anymore. For a brief instant, something flickered across her face. Panic? Maybe. But it vanished in an instant, replaced by frigid defiance. You're being ridiculous, she yelled, her voice rising. Every couple fights. Look, that doesn't mean you should give up. Vanessa. This is not simply an argument. I replied strongly. This is years of me bending over backwards to make you happy, disregarding my own wants and limits while you take without ever giving back. She leapt to her feet, the chair grinding loudly on the floor. She spat while making a sacrifice. What exactly have you sacrificed, Luke? Because of where I am standing. Every time I ask for aid, you just complain. I laughed briefly and without humor. Help. What do you mean by throwing coffee in my face? Help. Vanessa flinched, her face flaming. This was a mistake. She whispered, her voice softer now. I was angry. I was not thinking. That is the problem, Vanessa. You never think. You simply react. And I'm always the one left to cope with the repercussions. The silence descended between us, dense and stifling. The weight of my words sank into the space between us like an unbreakable fact. She moved closer, her voice shaking with barely restrained rage. So, Luke, what are you saying? So you're done? So you're just walking away? I met her gaze. My heart is beating. Yes. Her face wrinkled. Shock and disbelief flashed across her face. Are you serious? I am, I said. The words sounded both terrible and empowering. Vanessa, I can't keep doing this. I need to start putting myself first. She stared at me, her lips parted as if to dispute, lash out, or speak up. However, no words came. Finally, she turned away. Her shoulders slumped. Fine, she answered quietly. Do what you want. The finality of it was like a punch in the gut. But I did not let it show. I turned toward the door and grabbed my keys from the counter. I'll contact you with the details. I spoke over my shoulder. You are my lawyer. With that, I strolled outside into the sunlight. The door slowly closed behind me. My chest felt constricted and my legs shaky. But, for the first time in years, I could breathe freely. I had no idea what the future contained, but one thing was certain. I was not going back. Driving away from the house, it felt as if the weight of the argument lingered, leaving me exhausted but lighter. For years, I had been operating on autopilot, putting out flames in a marriage that had long since lost its luster. Today signified the beginning of something new, the first step to recovering my life. I pulled into Thomas's driveway. My mind was already racing with all that needed to be done. The house might still bear my name, but it no longer felt like home. That revelation sank home, but it also spurred a sense of urgency. If I was going to rebuild, I needed to act quickly and wisely before I could even knock on Thomas's door. Well? He asked cautiously. It's finished, I said, stepping inside. She knows it is over. Thomas gave a low whistle as he closed the door behind me. How did she take it? I shrugged, sinking onto the couch. About as well as one would anticipate. There was some yelling and guilt-tripping, but she didn't resist me as much as I expected. I believe she knew what was coming. He nodded and handed me a bottle of cool water. That is a start. Now comes the difficult part. I raised an eyebrow. It's harder than it was this morning. Thomas smirked. It's much harder. You need to plan your future movements, money and housing. This is legal stuff. You need to make sure she doesn't surprise you later. He was not mistaken. I took a long drink of water while reclining back against the couch. Where should I even begin? Thomas grabbed a notebook and pen from the kitchen counter and turned to a new page. First things first. Finances. You have joint accounts, right? I nodded. Yeah, but the majority of our money comes from my paycheck. She does not work, so you must protect yourself. Thomas. Cut in. Transfer your direct deposit into a new account. Cancel any credit cards she has access to, and make sure she doesn't incur debt in your name while you're working things out. I frowned. That feels cruel. It is not harsh. It's clever, Thomas declared firmly. Trust me. You don't want to deal with financial problems on top of everything else. This is not about being petty. It's about being prepared. He was correct. Vanessa had never been bashful about spending, and if she wanted to be vindictive, there was nothing stopping her from depleting our accounts or maxing out our credit cards. I took out my phone and began scribbling down notes. New bank account. Cancel shared credit cards. Update your passwords. What happens next? I asked. Housing. Thomas said, tapping his pen on the notebook. Are you remaining here for now, or are you seeking your own place? I paused. The idea of staying at Thomas's indefinitely did not sit well with me. I did not want to overstay my welcome, but finding a new place felt intimidating, especially since I didn't know what my finances would be like following the divorce. For the time being, we're here, I said finally, but I'll look for something tiny. An apartment, perhaps. Thomas nodded. That was a good call. In the meantime, compile a list of everything you need from the house. Clothes, vital documents, and everything you don't want to lose. I winced at the idea of going back there, but he was correct. There were some things I couldn't leave behind. My passport, birth certificate, insurance certificates, and personal belongings, such as the watch my father gave me before his death. I will figure it out. I mumbled and added it to the list. Thomas went on to discuss legal matters. You have an appointment with the lawyer this afternoon, right? Yes, I said, but I wasn't sure what to ask. Thomas leaned forward, his expression serious. Ask about everything. If necessary, file for divorce and restraining orders. How to secure your assets. The more you understand, the better prepared you will be. I agreed, my stomach churning at the prospect of sitting across from a lawyer and explaining the shambles my life had become. But Thomas was correct. This was about asserting control, even if it meant confronting some painful truths. What about work? He inquired, staring at me. Are you taking time off or returning? I paused. My employment provided me with both financial and emotional support, but the idea of coming into the office and pretending everything was okay seemed unfathomable. I'll be back, I eventually said, but possibly not this week. I need a few days to work everything out. Thomas grinned. You're doing well, man. This is the most difficult portion, but you're handling it. I gave a quick laugh. It doesn't feel like it. Trust me, he replied, clapping my shoulder. You've got it. The remainder of the morning was a whirlwind of phone calls and emails. I opened a separate bank account, canceled our joint credit cards, and changed the passwords for everything from my email to my online banking. Each task seemed like a tiny victory, one step closer to independence. When it was time to go to the lawyer's office, Thomas insisted on joining me. You need someone to take notes, he added with a smile. Plus, I'd like to watch this lawyer of yours in action. I did not argue. Having him present made the situation feel less overwhelming. The lawyer's office was smaller than I anticipated. Tucked into a tiny office on the outskirts of downtown, the receptionist greeted us pleasantly, and we were seated across from a man who appeared to be a no-nonsense attorney. He extended a solid handshake and said, Mr. Peters, I have been briefed on your position. Let's speak about how we'll defend you throughout the following hour. We've covered everything. Finances, assets, what to expect during the divorce procedure. He was comprehensive and direct, outlining a detailed plan for the months ahead. I felt surprised relief when we departed. It was not over. Not by a long shot, but I finally felt like I had a chance. As Thomas and I walked back to the car, he clapped my back. See, you're managing this like a pro. I managed a faint smile. Take one step at a time. Thomas insisted that he wasn't alone. I nodded and gripped my keys. The road ahead was lengthy, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was headed in the right direction. The trip back to the Mass was an odd combination of accomplishment and terror. I had taken concrete measures forward, such as deleting joint accounts and obtaining legal representation, but the confrontation with Vanessa remained a looming presence in my mind. I knew she was not going to take my departure lightly, and I had no illusions that things would remain amicable. Vanessa did not lose gracefully. As I pulled into Thomas's driveway, my phone vibrated on the passenger seat. I cast a downward glance. Vanessa's name flashed over the screen, and my chest constricted as I wondered whether to respond. Ignoring her would make everything worse, but I was not prepared for another shouting match. With a sigh, I took up the phone and placed it to my ear. What is it, Vanessa? I inquired, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. Her voice came across as aggressive and accusatory. Where in the hell are you? Look, I just got home, and you're gone. What is this about? Lawyers and canceled cards? Are you actually doing this? Yes. Vanessa, I replied firmly. I am doing this. I could hear her tone shift from disbelief to rage. I told you this morning. I am done. Done. She spit, shocked. You don't only get to choose. You're finished. We are married. Look, you can't walk away like this. I do, Vanessa. The first spoke, my voice steady yet weary. I get to walk away. You made your decisions, and now I'm making mine. There was a beat of silence before her tone changed again, this time with steely resolve. You're making a huge mistake, she stated coldly and venomously. And if you think you can just abandon me, you're mistaken. My brother is coming over later, and I expect you to be present. I almost smiled at their arrogance. Anderson is not my duty, I explained. Neither is this mess. I have spent years cleaning up after him. After you. And I'm finished. Don't expect me to be present when he shows up. Vanessa's voice became nasty. You are such a coward, she hissed. You are abandoning your family, because you are unable to handle little conflict. Is this the type of man you are? I closed my eyes and gripped the driving wheel, fighting to keep my rage under control. Vanessa, you can call me whatever you want, but I am not coming back. Not now. Not ever. Before she could react, I hung up the phone and flung it onto the seat. My hands trembled, but it wasn't from fear. It was rage. I sat for a time, allowing the silence of the automobile to wash over me. Finally, I stepped outside and went inside. Thomas was in the kitchen when I entered. I have a beer in one hand and a sandwich in the other. He looked up when I stepped in. His expression was immediately alarmed. What happened? He asked Vanessa. I said simply, tossing my keys on the counter. She is outraged, accusing me of leaving her and Anderson. Thomas shook his head and set his beard down. Of course she is, he mumbled. She is losing control and is unsure how to handle it. I leaned against the counter and ran a hand through my hair. She explained that Anderson will be arriving later. Like that's intended to terrify me into returning. Thomas lifted an eyebrow and said nothing. I replied strongly, I am not going back. She can cope with her brother on her own. Thomas nodded in approval. Good. Stick to your guns, man. She's trying to control you, and the best thing you can do is avoid giving her the reaction she wants. I exhaled deeply, some of the strain in my chest lessening. I'm just not sure how this will finish. She's not the type of person to let things go. Thomas smirked. She does not need to let it go. You just need to make sure she doesn't take you down with her. You've got a lawyer. You have a plan. Allow her to stew in her own mess. I nodded. His words settled something within me. For so long, I'd been caught up in Vanessa's fury and manipulation. Always smoothing things out. Always wanting to maintain peace. But now, for the first time, I felt like I could break free. I didn't have to play her game anymore. Later that evening, while Thomas and I sat on the couch, watching a dumb action flick, my phone buzzed again. I glanced at the screen. Vanessa Davis is here. He's furious. This has to be fixed. I stared at the message, my jaw tightening. For years, it had been my responsibility to clean up messes, settle conflicts, and accept blame when things went wrong. But not anymore. I typed a simple response. I am not coming back. This is your mess to deal with. Her reply came almost immediately. You're going to regret this. I turned off the phone and placed it face down on the table. Thomas gave a quick peek, raising an eyebrow. Is everything okay? I nodded and leaned back against the cushions. Yeah. Everything is fine, for the first time in a long while. I really believed it. That first night in Thomas's house seemed like an odd combination of relief and restlessness. I lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling with my mind racing. Vanessa will come to regret her statements, played on repeat in my head, yet beneath the noise, a small, persistent voice kept repeating. You're free now. The morning began with a sense of purpose. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I knew one thing: I needed to reconstruct my life, a clean slate. That was both horrifying and exhilarating. For the first time in years, I had the ability to select what happened next. When I got up, Thomas was already in the kitchen, nonchalantly pouring cereal into a bowl, as if he hadn't spent the night reflecting on his life choices. Morning, he said, looking up. How did you sleep? Better. I lied. To be honest, I hadn't gotten much sleep, but I didn't want to concentrate on it. I believe I should start looking for a place today, I said. Thomas laid his dish down and crossed his arms. You don't need to rush. You are welcome to stay for as long as you need. I appreciate that, I said, and I intended it. Thomas had been a rock throughout all, and I wasn't sure where I'd be without him, but I needed to get some answers. I couldn't live on his couch indefinitely. He grinned. Okay, fair enough. Let me know if you need anything. Moving, furniture, shopping. Awkward. Landlord negotiations. I am your guy. I grinned, appreciating his calm support. Thank you, guy. After breakfast, I grabbed my laptop and began looking for apartments. It was overwhelming. There were so many alternatives, and I had no idea where to start. Did I want to be close to work? Near a park or somewhere with a view? I realized I hadn't considered what I wanted in a long time. Most of my decisions over the last few years have revolved around Vanessa, her tastes, desires, and expectations. This knowledge was sobering. I opted to make it basic, economical, safe, and close to work. Everything else could arrive later. After a few hours, I discovered a potential lead, a little one-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't extravagant, but it seemed tidy and well-kept, and the rent fit my budget. I called the landlady, a pleasant-sounding woman named Mrs. Peterson, and scheduled an appointment to see the apartment that afternoon. As I hung up, I felt an odd mix of worry and exhilaration in my chest. This was happening. I was actually doing this. Mrs. Peterson and I met at the flat, a pleasant woman in her 60s with silver hair and a kind smile. You must be Luke, she remarked, shaking my hand. Come in. I will show you around. The flat was small but comfortable, with hardwood floors and huge windows that let in lots of natural light. The kitchen, while antiquated, was practical, and the living room was just big enough for a couch and a television. The bedroom was small but had a good-sized closet, and the bathroom, though modest, was clean. Mrs. Peterson responded. It's not much. I took it all in, but it's a good place to begin. The former tenants were a young couple who recently purchased a home. Thus, it is available immediately. It's great, I murmured, startled by how deeply I meant it. For the first time in years, I could see myself somewhere, a place that was exclusively mine. Mrs. Peterson grinned. I enjoy your zeal. If you are interested, we can begin the paperwork today. I am interested. I spoke without hesitation. By the time I returned to Thomas's apartment that evening, the lease had been signed and the keys were in my possession. It seemed weird. This is such a small sliver of metal. Yet it symbolized far more than just access to an apartment. It was freedom, independence, a fresh start. Thomas met me at the entrance. His gaze quickly focused on the keys. His grin grew wider. "Well, look at you, Mr. Independent. How does it feel?" "Terrifying, I confess. But I couldn't stop myself from smiling and feeling fantastic." He clapped my back. "You are doing it, man. Take one step at a time." The following few days were a whirlwind of packing and planning. I produced a list of the necessities I needed to get from the house, including clothes, paperwork, and a few personal items, and scheduled a pickup when Vanessa would not be present. The procedure was unpleasant and uncomfortable, but I completed it without incident. I placed each item in my car. It felt as if I was reclaiming a part of myself. Moving day arrived quickly, and Thomas, along with a few common acquaintances, assisted in transporting boxes and furniture to my new home. It was exhausting, but by the end, I was surrounded by my stuff in an environment that seemed like the start of something new. That night, I sat on the floor of my empty living room, eating pizza right out of the box while staring at the walls. The apartment was quiet, perhaps too quiet, but it did not feel empty. It felt calm for the first time in years. I wasn't walking on eggshells, waiting for the next dispute to start. The silence was not oppressive. That was mine. I leaned back against the wall and took a long breath. The road ahead was uncertain, with so much to find out. But as I sat there, surrounded by the bare bones of my new life, I sensed something I hadn't for a long time: hope. The days after my move felt like I was walking into a completely new universe, one in which every decision, every quiet moment, and every part of my space belonged to me. It wasn't simply about unloading and rearranging things. It was about rediscovering myself outside of the relationship that had dominated my life for so long. That first morning in the apartment felt unreal. Sunlight poured through the slats, creating lengthy shadows on the hardwood floor. There were no angry words from the other room. There were no passive hostile statements in the air, nor was there any strain bearing down on me. For the first time in years, I awoke without the customary feeling of fear. I brewed coffee and sat at the small thrift store table I had acquired, admiring the calm street below. A jogger passed by. Someone walked their dog. Birds chirped in the distance. As I took my first drink of coffee, I was struck by how different it was from the mayhem I had left behind. A feeling settled in my chest, one I hadn't had in a long time. The following several weeks were a blur of adjustment and growth. I threw myself into developing a new regimen, something solid to anchor me. Work kept me occupied during the day and evening. I concentrated on making the flat my own, by hanging photos and organizing books on a shelf. Choosing a new rug. Each modest action seemed like a step closer to restoring my independence. However, the nights proved to be the most difficult. Without work or unpacking to distract me, sometimes the silence felt oppressive, nearly suffocating. Memories of Vanessa, and the life we had created together, would come in unannounced. I'd sit on the couch, staring at old images that I hadn't had the nerve to throw away, and wonder where it all went wrong. There was loss, fury, and an unexpected sense of relief. I was lamenting the life I had previously imagined, while also seizing the opportunity to begin a new one. One afternoon, while unpacking a box labeled personal, I came across my old journal. I hadn't written in it in several years. Vanessa had always disregarded it as a waste of time, but when I had it in my hands, flicking over pages of my younger self, dreams, and thoughts, something inside me stirred. I took a pen, set up my modest workstation, and began to write. At first, the words were slow and reluctant. I wrote about the relocation, the apartment, and the difficulty of beginning anew. However, as I persisted, the floodgates opened. I wrote about Vanessa, the good, the terrible, and the turning points that convinced me I needed to go. With each word spilled onto the page, I wrote about the years I'd spent compromising, losing pieces of myself along the way. I felt lighter, as if I had shed the burden of the past. Reconnecting with old acquaintances was an unexpected source of healing. Thomas encouraged me to contact people I had lost touch with, whom Vanessa had disregarded or pushed away. I started small, texting here and meeting for coffee there. Each discussion reminded me of who I used to be before my life became centered on Vanessa and her expectations. One of the most meaningful reunions was with Sophie, an old colleague who had always been a reassuring presence at coffee. I revealed my tale, which I had not done with many people before. She listened. Her expression reflected genuine care and understanding. "Look," she stated in a firm voice, "you're gutsy to walk away. That is not something everyone can do. Give yourself credit for the strength it required." Her comments stayed with me for so long. I had viewed leaving as a failure, an admission that I could not save my marriage. Sophie, on the other hand, helped me reframe the situation. Leaving was not a failure. It was about survival. It represented strength. As the weeks and months passed, my flat began to seem more like home. The previously empty walls were now adorned with images, artwork, and objects that reflected me, not who Vanessa expected me to be. I discovered joy in the little things. Cooking food without judgment. Reading late at night. Playing music as loud as I wanted. These were hardly great gestures, but they were mine. That made them powerful. One gloomy afternoon, I strolled into a bookstore and discovered a novel that I had enjoyed in college. The Awakening by Kate Chopin. I remembered how deeply Edna's quest of self-discovery had touched me back then. I purchased the book and spent the remainder of the evening rereading it. Tears streamed down my cheeks as I recognized elements of myself in her quest to restore her identity. That night, inspired by the story, I opened my laptop and started typing. This was not merely journaling. It was more of a story, reflecting my own trip but with fictional characters and a narrative arc. The words flowed out of me, propelled by years of suppressed emotions. Writing became my escape, therapy, and means of making sense of things. By the time the divorce was official, I felt completely changed. The legal battles were exhausting, but they had also given me resilience. I confronted Vanessa's charges and manipulation head-on, with the help of my lawyer and friends. And I emerged stronger. The day I got the final paperwork, I sat on my couch, staring at the packet in my hands. It was over. Vanessa's authority over my life has officially ended. I wasn't just free of her. I was free to be myself. That evening, I cooked myself a simple dinner, sipped a glass of wine, and sat down at my desk to continue writing the novel I had begun. Had developed into something larger, more important. It wasn't only about my experiences. It was about hope, resilience, and the power to choose oneself. As I typed the last lines of a chapter, I sat back in my chair and smiled. The road ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time in years, I was not terrified of what was ahead. This was not simply a fresh chapter in my life. It was an entirely new novel. And for the first time, I held the pen. I raised my glass for a quiet toast. To the future, to the life I was creating and the person I was becoming. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was right where I was supposed to be.